Tonight, President Trump says trade talks between the White House and Canada are over. The president abruptly pulling the plug on negotiations with the top buyer of U.S. goods. The president angry about Canada's new digital services tax. The president, as you see right there, calling it, quote, a direct and blatant attack on our country. He went on to write that the United States will let Canada know the tariff that they will be paying to do business with the United States of America within the next 7-day period. You can see right here all three major stock exchanges reacting to the president's post in real time. The Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ briefly dropped on the news. But look at that. Not only a sharp rebound, but the NASDAQ and the S&P closing at all-time highs. Even as this tariff fight drags on, Wall Street rolls on. My political sources are here. Karen Finney, the former communications director for the Democratic National Committee, and the Republican strategist, Michael Singleton. Michael, on the one hand, Canada imposes a tax. We know the president. You punch him, he punches back. What he perceives as a punch. However, the markets are rebounding. Yeah, the president still has issues out there with consumer confidence and what Americans think about, right track, wrong track. You want to do this again now?
Yeah, look, I think the market is trending in the right direction. I understand, and Kieran and I were talking about this, I understand why the president would be somewhat frustrated with the tax from the Canadians, but I would also imagine the Canadians probably want to protect their own growing technology sector. I would, however, want the Canadians to partner with us and buy chips from NVIDIA versus chips from Hawaii and the Chinese. And so these are some of the global things that I'm thinking about. So I'd probably go back to the conversation if I'm advising the president and say, let's figure out a way to, at a minimum, lower the tax so the U.S. companies greater benefit.
Right, but they didn't do it in talks, so that part's interesting. He did seem to be starting to have a decent relationship with the new prime minister. But let me take the contrarian argument. They just announced a new tax retroactive to what, 2022 on some of our biggest companies, right? We're talking about Apple here. We're talking about Google here. We're talking about Amazon here. We're talking about Microsoft here. So forget the name Trump. Forget that he's a Republican. Shouldn't any American president say, oh, no, those are big players in my economy?
Of course they should. But the problem is, we're supposed to be having these 90 deals in 90 days. I think they've gotten about 2 of them. So the problem is the context we find ourselves in. Yes, you would want an American president fighting that fight. But as we've seen, the volatility in the market, the lack of consumer confidence. I mean, this anxiety that people are feeling is not going to go away. And if we hear the president, which I expect we will, early next week, come out swinging, what is that going to do to the markets? Because, again, he could have said, we're going to continue to talk. That's not his way. So, of course, he's making a big deal about it, and we'll see how they react.
When this became a big problem, turmoil in the markets last time, there was the 90-day pause. Now we're 12 days away from the end of the 90-day pause, and the president says.
Which countries, if any, are close to agreements with the administration?
Well, that's an interesting question. We've made a deal with China. We've made a deal with probably 4 or 5 different countries, with the UK. But, we have 200 countries. You could say 200 countries plus. We can't do that. So at a certain point over the next week and a half or so, or maybe before, we're going to send out a letter. We talked to many of the countries, and we're just going to tell them what they have to pay to do business in the United States. And it's going to go very quickly.
Maybe a foolish question, because this is the way he is. This is the way he acts about this, and the people around him say it works, right? You threaten, you bully, you threaten, you get back. But given what happened last time, with his own approval rating, with the turmoil in the markets and everything, don't you want to do this in private?
Yeah, look, I think the president is very sensitive to market ups and downs. Obviously, he cares a lot about that. I actually think, though, John, that this is perhaps a better approach. And I was stating this about a month ago, that I would have preferenced the president to go to multiple countries and say, hey, this is a baseline for the United States in terms of trade. Let's all just agree to this and figure it out versus piecemeal going country by country. It's 200 countries. That's a lot of countries to try to figure out. I actually support the effort of saying, hey, let's go to everybody and say, this is our baseline number. Let's agree and let's move on with business.
Go ahead.
They said they were going to get 90 deals done in 90 days. And we knew when they said it, that was not true, not likely to happen. And here we are. And he said they've gotten 4 or 5. And now he's saying, oh, well, really, it's 200. And that's a lot.
If you're covering campaigns like I do, or if you're planning campaigns and advising candidates like you do, one of the big challenges is, which data point do we look at? Which data point? There's conflicting data points. Which one do we think is going to matter closer to the election? You're a Democrat here.
Yeah.
But the president did launch military action against Iran. There were no troops involved. The ceasefire appears to be holding. The markets did set some records today. A good week for the president after a stretch in which Republicans were getting nervous about the midterm climate?
Well, it's interesting because also, obviously, today the president, this announcement from the Supreme Court, he's feeling emboldened. And yet, I was looking at Real Clear Politics averages. We've seen several weeks, not just one outlier poll, several weeks of polling where his approval rates are going down. His handling of the economy, immigration, foreign policy underwater. Quinnipiac poll this week, right, showed people said they don't like the Marines being in California. They don't like the National Guard. They want a path to citizenship for people who've been here. So the problem that he has and the opportunity that Democrats have is to offer a different vision and to make the point, it's not just a check on power, but like, let's make sure we're getting it right. Because one of the things that we're seeing is people are not happy with the way things are going. And he never talks about the economy, which is the number one issue.
President Trump immediately ending trade talks with Canada, vowing to announce in the coming days a new tariff rate on the top buyer of American goods, Canada. CNN's Kristen Holmes is at the White House. Kristen, why is President Trump suddenly ending these trade talks?
Well, it's all about this digital tax, Jake. I mean, essentially, Canada has decided to go forward with a digital tax on American companies that would go into effect on June 30th. Now, this has actually they've gone forward with this since last Friday, but it appears to have just gotten on President Trump's radar. And in fact, in addition to these digital big companies having to pay this tax, they'd actually have to pay a retro tax as well. So they'd owe billions of dollars when the time comes on June 30th. So this was clearly brought to President Trump's attention. He said he was going to cut off all ties with trade talks with Canada. Here's what he said.
They were foolish to do it. And so I said, we're going to stop all negotiations with Canada right now until they straighten out their act. We have all the cards. You know, we do a lot of business with Canada, but relatively little. They do most of their businesses with us. And when you have that circumstance, you treat people better.
So a couple of things to know here. One is that this is pretty surprising given what we saw just a week and a half ago when President Trump was at the G7 sitting next to Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, and they seemed to be getting along. They said that they had differences on trade, but that they were going to work through them, and they really thought that they could make a deal before July with each country getting a little bit of what they want. So this is clearly a 180 there, particularly in Trump's direction. We also know that Trump administration officials had urged Carney not to go forward with this digital tax. Obviously, he went forward with it anyway. And just one thing to note, President Trump in a Truth Social post earlier said that going forward with this digital services tax was a direct and blatant attack on our country, Jake.